How do we know when it's on?
He'll give us a signal when he's ready. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm glad to see you back again, and I would like to know, how have people been doing? How many people met their weight loss goal this week? Can I see hands? 1, 2, 3, 4. Very good. Give them a hand. They've been working at it. Yes. How about fiber goals? How many people were up to 45 grams of fiber a day or more? Yes. Almost. All right. You're working on it. Getting there. Okay, what's our goal for this next week?
50.
50 or more for the rest of your life.
Thank goodness, I can't go up any higher.
All right, she's saying thank goodness because she can't go up any higher. So 50 is where she's going to get this week and stay there.
Okay, what about water goals? How many people met their water goals this week? Yes.
Yes,
Okay, very good. Yes, absolutely. And let's see, did anyone try a new recipe this week? Yes.
Good,
Okay,
good.
great. That is wonderful. The average housewife, by the way, or the average person that cooks only 10 meals. They cook little variations of the 10 meals, but they'll be basically the same 10 meals. So if you're trying to do a lifestyle change, all you got to do is learn 10 different 10 entrees, and then you just change up the sides a little bit, and you have lots of variety. It'll work out well for you. So maybe make a notebook or something, keep track of what you're doing, and you can have a big celebration when you get to 10. Okay, let's see, blood sugars. Is anyone noticing downward trends in blood sugars? 1. Is that all? Oh, Alan's sleeping. Alan
They're
did.
talking.
Okay, another one here.
The change of season, that changed daylight saving time messed me up. But otherwise, I'm doing pretty
Okay, she says that the change to daylight saving time messed her up, but otherwise she's doing well. It's not uncommon when someone gets a disruption in their schedule that they'll see your blood sugar numbers go up a little bit. We'll take that in stride. We can get over that. And anyway, anybody have any problems meeting a goal this week? Oh, someone's humming the Hallelujah chorus. Well, we'll have to read between the lines on that one. So maybe you can discuss that when you get in your groups later on this evening. Well, I'm so glad everyone is doing as well as they are. And today our topic is fats that worsen diabetes. And when people get a diagnosis of diabetes, they typically are told, you've got to watch your carbs. You have to restrict your carbohydrate intake. And that may be good, but there are actually some fats that make diabetes worse. Now, if you're not eating carbohydrates, what do you have to eat more of? You have to eat more proteins and fats. You have proteins, fats, and carbohydrates that we eat for energy. That's all there is. That's all that's on the plate. So if you're restricting the carbohydrates, that means you're eating more of the other things. But yeah, it may be that God knew that there were some fats that made diabetes worse when he told the children of Israel this through Moses. He said, "It shall be a perpetual statute for your generations throughout all your dwellings that ye eat neither fat nor blood." So that's something to think about. Why did he say that? And maybe you'll begin to understand a little bit more of why that was included in the Levitical laws many years ago, and by the time we get to the end of tonight's session. But before we go any further, let me just have another prayer for you. Heavenly Father, first of all, I want to say thank you for being with these people and helping them achieve some of these goals. And the end result of that, we know, is better health. And I thank you also for the healing that you're giving them, for the blood pressures that are coming down, for the blood sugars that are coming down, and for the weight that's coming off, And I just pray your continued presence to be with them. Now, as we enter tonight's discussion, we're going to be discussing fats. And so I pray that you'll make their minds like sponges, especially help them to latch on to ideas that they can implement in their own homes that will help them reverse their disease. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, as we have said before, what we're doing is for educational purposes only. We're teaching you things, and it's up to you to work with your physicians, if you haven't fired them, to help you make the adjustments that you need to, that you can safely come off of medications, and just so they can understand the exercise, the changes in your lifestyle that you're doing, and why you are seeing better blood sugars and your weight is coming down, and better blood pressure. So education only here, but work with your physician before you make these changes. So learning objectives today, you're going to be able to describe the relationship between obesity and diabetes parameters. Pandemics. A big difference there. You also can identify which fats make diabetes worse, and which fats are better substitutions for bad fats. So there's fats that are bad, there's fats that are better for you. So you're going to learn about that. Also, the effect of high fat consumption on insulin resistance. Insulin resistance, we learned the very first night, is what? The cells are locked. They have too much energy stored in them, and they're pushing back against insulin. That's right, they have all that junk in them. And so you're going to learn what happens with the fats with insulin resistance. And then name a macronutrient, that's the big nutrients, that the body prefers to burn instead of fat. So before we get into all of that, I want to talk to you about Inez. Inez took care of her sister who had diabetes until her sister passed away. And Inez knew that she needed to do something to improve her health. At that time, she had a beginning A1C of 12.2 when her sister passed away, and she said, it's time for me now to take care of myself. So she read up, she learned what she could, and by the way, this is a picture of a model. This is not Inez's picture. Not everybody gives us permission to use theirs, and so we have other people to fill in. So this is a model tonight, in case any of you recognize her. But so Inez started, and she started losing weight. She knew that's one of the things she needed to do, so she was diligent, and she had lost about 35 pounds when she learned about our program. So she came to the program, but Inez was very busy raising her grandchildren. So we talked about burst training, we talked about the walking, we talked about the fiber, and she started. She increased her fiber, and she was doing quite well, but she was challenged with the exercise after meals because she's cooking for these kids and dealing with all of that. But she figured out that when she'd get up in the morning and start her day, she'd get some laundry going. And by the time breakfast was over, she would have laundry out of the dryer, and she would take it and put it back on the bed. So when it came time to do the walking, she would walk down the hall, get a garment, fold the garment as she walked back down the hall, take it back to the bed, lay it down, pick up another garment, and she did that for 20 minutes. And after lunch, she would do the same thing. And by the time she got her walking in, her laundry was folded. So she worked it into her lifestyle. And that is one of the things that really helps us. Instead of trying to set apart, some of you are already walking. So you can do your burst training while you're walking. Walk your distance, walk so far, and then speed up for 30 seconds. Really put the energy into it, then back off until you can catch your breath good. Anyway, so that is what Inez worked on. So when she came back for our 6-month follow-up, she had lost an additional 35 pounds, so a total of 70. She was off her blood pressure medicines, off her diabetes medicines, and her A1C was down to 5.8. She was so excited for the changes that had come into her life. ReversingDiabetes.org says that type 2 diabetes is known as a lifestyle disease. How many times have you heard that in the past? Have you ever heard before you came to this seminar that it was a lifestyle? Most of the time, that's not what we hear. We hear it's genetics. My mom had it, my dad had it, my aunt had it, and therefore I'm going to have it. But they say it's known as a lifestyle disease sustained by a culture that promotes inactivity and unhealthy food choices, all leading to weight gain and obesity, the leading cause of type 2 diabetes. Indeed, 80% of the overweight will develop diabetes. So you see there's 20% that don't develop it. You have to have the gene, but there are a lot of genes, and we're going to talk about that on night 8, I believe. So how fats affect diabetes?
Okay, so we learned in a previous lecture that one of the things that causes diabetes is, first of all, you get too much fat in the muscle cells. That's usually where the problem starts. And from there, when the muscle cells get all the fat in it that they can hold reasonably, it starts shifting the fat downstream, and then it begins to collect in the liver, and it begins to collect in the pancreas. We call that the twin cycle hypothesis. That was developed by Dr. Roy Taylor out of Newcastle University. And he said that it's like two separate causative structures, and both elements need to be there in order for the diabetes to develop. But you've got to get rid of both of them as well for the diabetes to go away. So when you get too much fat in the muscle, it's characterized by increased insulin resistance. So again, as your cells become insulin resistant, the amount of insulin that you need to move the sugar from the blood into the cell, it gradually begins to go up. Every meal, it just gradually rises until your insulin levels are quite high, which overworks the pancreas. And it interferes with the glucose transport in the cell. So if you get too much fat in the liver, you developed increased insulin resistance in the liver, and it also interferes with your fasting blood glucose. So when you check your fasting glucose in the morning, and it is 100, say 28, well, that's in the diabetes range, but that is caused because there's too much insulin resistance in the liver. There's too much fat in the liver. So you've got to get rid of the fat in the liver. Fortunately for us, that is something that happens fairly quickly. So within just a matter of a few weeks, most people are able to get the liver level of fat down, and their blood sugars will return to normal in the morning when that happens. But the problem is, when they sit down and eat a meal, their sugars are still go out of control. And the reason for that is the pancreas is responsible for first phase insulin secretion after a meal, and it no longer functions properly. So your beta cells also like sit down in a rocking chair and they refuse to work. And they will get in this retirement mode, so to speak, and they just sit on the rocking chair and do that for 2 to 5 years. And if you don't put them back to work, eventually they will die. So by the time a person gets a diagnosis of diabetes, their pancreas is already functioning at about 50% or less of normal capacity. So gradually their insulin levels have begun dropping because beta cells are dying, and then blood sugar begins to spike. You can go to the doctor and he'll check something, let's see, they call it what do they call it? Where you check is it C-reactive protein? C-peptide, yes. Okay, yeah, he looks for a C-peptide test. And that will tell you how much insulin that you're making. And when he determines that your insulin level is low, then he's going to put you on insulin levels to try to get things working. But remember, we have a problem now with insulin resistance. So in order to get the sugars down, he oftentimes has to go up to abnormally very high insulin levels. I've had people come to the class that were taking 200 units of insulin a day. 200 units, guys, that's a lot. And so anyway, but we've already talked about some of that in a previous lecture. So by the time a person gets that diagnosis of diabetes, they have already had destruction going on in their body to their internal organs for 13 and a half years on average. So you're already quite far down the pike before you even realize you got a problem. Can you get that back? And can a person survive on 50% pancreatic function? And the answer is yes, if you control insulin resistance. But there's a new study that just came out probably 4 or 5 years ago now. And in this new study, they determined if a person reverses through lifestyle and maintains for 2 years, the pancreas returns to normal function and morphology. That means the shape of the pancreas even will return to normal. If the pancreas has shrunk in size or if it's gotten larger in size, it will return to its normal size and function. Beta cells can be regenerated. We used to say when they're dead, they're gone. But we now know that they can be regenerated, and there's several things that can cause that to happen. And so we also recently have learned that, we've known this for quite a while actually, that a low-fat diet will cause your insulin resistance to drop very rapidly. Well, you think about this, typically what we do is we restrict the carbohydrates, and so we increase your intake of fats and of proteins. But what we've learned as we have studied fats and diabetes is when you decrease the fat intake to about 15% or less of calories, your insulin resistance drops. And we knew this as far back as 1927. J.S. Sweeney was doing some research, and in one of his research studies, he took medical students and he placed them on 7 different diets, and the diets ranged from high fat to high carbohydrate. And what he discovered was, regardless of what time in the study the person was eating which diet, those that were eating a high-fat diet consistently had higher insulin resistance. And when they decreased the fat in the diet, then right away the insulin resistance would change. Now, we have discovered that in the body, physiologically, carbohydrates and fats are mutually exclusive fuels. If you eat a high-fat diet, now the standard American diet is about 35% fat. So when you eat a high-fat diet like that, or oftentimes even higher, somebody goes on keto diet, what is going to happen physiologically is as you ingest that food, the fats are absorbed into the lymphatic system. Lymphatic system is another set of vessels that carries tissue fluid back into the heart, where it's mixed back with the blood and circulates through the body again. But when the high fat level enters the lymphatic system, the body upregulates the hormones and enzymes that are necessary for fat metabolism, but it downregulates the hormones and enzymes that are responsible for carbohydrate metabolism. So that means if you're eating a high-fat diet, you're going to be very insulin resistant. And that's going to create a problem for you. It's going to keep you diabetic for the rest of your life by making that kind of transition. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's the kind of diet that we put people on is causing them to stay insulin resistant. Now, what happens when you do the flip side? When you lower the fat intake in the diet to 15% or less, then what happens is you don't have the fat to be absorbed into the lymphatic system. The carbohydrates go down, they're broken down, and as the sugars then begin to be absorbed in the body and your sugar levels rise, the body upregulates the enzymes and hormones that are necessary for carbohydrate metabolism, and it downregulates those for fat metabolism, which is just amazing. So what happens when you reduce the fat? Your glucose intolerance is also reduced. So cut the fat down. You know, they took adolescents, for instance. These adolescents, they took adolescents and they put them in a controlled situation in a hospital ward, and they gave them an overnight infusion of lipids, fats. And the next morning they checked their insulin resistance. Insulin resistance was up. So the next day they gave them another medication, and this medication was designed to help them excrete fat from the blood. What do you think happened to insulin resistance? Their insulin resistance came right back down. So that was interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about the history of dietary fat. Prior to 1910, our primary source of fat in the diet was butter fat, tallow. Tallow is beef fat, and lard. Those were the three primary sources that we had for fat. There were other sources, but much less in the diet. In 1911, trans fats were added to the diet. Now, trans fats, anyone know what trans fats are? Yeah, we have 2 or 3 people here. Those are liquid vegetable fats that have been hydrogenated. You've heard of partially hydrogenated vegetable shortening? You know, the story goes that it was around 1910 that Procter & Gamble started producing a product that was 99 44/100% pure. Anyone know what that product was? No. Close. No. Had something to... Ivory soap. Yes, ma'am. She gets an A for tonight. It was ivory soap. But the problem with ivory soap was it was in such demand that, you know, Procter & Gamble, I think, was located in Cincinnati at that time. And so they were scouring the whole Mississippi River Valley, hitting up every slaughterhouse, looking for fat renderings so that they could make their product. And there just wasn't enough fat to make the ivory soap to meet the demand. So they say, well, what can we do? And they found the answer in the cotton industry, cotton milling industry. They discovered if you crushed the cotton seed, you could extract an oil, and you take that oil and you can make your ivory soap out of the oil. But the problem is the ivory soap that was made out of the oil went rancid quickly at room temperature. And so that created a big problem, because who wants to bathe in a rancid soap? Nobody. And you know, people were washing their clothes in this soap, and they were washing dishes in this soap, and it was used for hand soap, and they were bathing in it and all kinds of other stuff, but they needed more fat. So they heard about a man in Europe that invented a process called hydrogenation. They put a man on a boat, sent him over, he purchased the patent from that man. They came back, and within a year they had a factory up running at maximum capacity making hydrogenated vegetable shortening, and they started making their soap out of that, and problem solved. In fact, the idea of hydrogenating a fat, they learned very quickly that a fat, these hydrogenated fats, you could sit them on a shelf and they would stay stable for months, even years sometimes. And so it was a very popular thing. So they started making the product Crisco that you heard about, and began marketing that. In fact, they would fill tractor trailers full of 2.5-pound tubs of Crisco, and they would go out and they would just give it away to housewives. Well, what did the housewives do? They said, no, that stuff isn't fit to eat. That's not food. So they put it on the pantry shelf and just left it there. But then the war broke out. And in the middle of the war, they were trying to pinch pennies and do whatever they could to conserve and make things stretch. And so they started making foods, biscuits, pancakes, and other such, using the Crisco. And the families didn't complain. They ate it. They didn't seem to have any ill effects that they could see right off. So they started using it because it was cheaper than butter, and it was more readily available. And but by the 1940s, usage of partially hydrogenated vegetable shortening had been linked to cancer. And by the 1950s, they linked it to heart disease. And then subsequent to that, it was linked to stroke and immune system disorders and inflammation and increased insulin resistance. And those last two things bring on cardiovascular disease and all kinds of stuff. It's the inflammation that's caused because of these that drives that. So its use was finally banned in 2018. But the government put in an exception. They said, if the food supplier files for a hardship exemption, then they can, we'll grant them an extension. So you still got to watch your labels because it's in our food supply. So what foods is that in? Well, it's predominantly in fried foods. You go to the restaurant and you eat the French fries or whatever. More than likely, they have been fried in partially hydrogenated vegetable shortening. Donuts, restaurant fried foods, baked goods, things like cakes and cookies and pie crusts and frozen pizzas often contain partially hydrogenated vegetable shortening. You need to put it back on the shelf if the label says that, because it'll make your diabetes worse. It increases the inflammation. It's not something that you want to have there. So that's one of the fats that makes diabetes worse. Now, let's talk a little bit about industrially produced oils. Now, I'm not talking about motor oil for your car. I'm talking about the oil that you buy in the store in the bottle and you bring home and you pour it into your cooking. The vegetable or seed or whatever you're making the oil out of is typically crushed. And then it's mixed with a petroleum distillate called hexane. And the hexane dissolves the fat, and you can, after you've dissolved the fat in the hexane, you pour the hexane off, and then you evaporate the hexane. And what you have left is a black tarry substance. It smells bad, it looks nasty, and it tastes bad. So they have to filter it, they have to deodorize it, and in the refining process, they actually heat that above the flash point of the oil. And when that happens, it changes the nature of the molecule, and the molecule becomes very pro-inflammatory. It causes inflammation in the body, and inflammation is one of the things that drives diabetes. So we really need to be careful of the health benefit of partially hydrogenated shortenings and even of industrially produced oil. They're very controverted right now in the medical literature. So you'll read one report that says, "Oh, you can eat this. You can eat this fat." Look carefully at how the study is set up. First of all, who set up the study? Back in the 1980s, late 1980s, I believe it was, Ronald Reagan privatized a lot of the research that was being done in America. And so now you get a very slanted approach when you're reading this. We're taught in graduate school that you can make the numbers say whatever you want them to say. So if somebody is doing research, they can manipulate those numbers, and you have to look at them very carefully to determine if they're really telling the truth. So there are other countries right now. Great Britain happens to be a country where they have not privatized scientific research. And when somebody receives a grant, it's public domain. It's free to everybody, and they want it out there. And so people aren't trying to make a buck on it, and they're not trying to sell a product. And consequently, Great Britain right now is leading the world in diabetes research, especially as it pertains to lifestyle. And so anyway, good stuff. But we have to be careful when we look at using these industrial oils because they are so pro-inflammatory. Now, what is the effect of high fat on the diet? What is the effect, of a high-fat diet on diabetes? It causes increased insulin resistance, and it inhibits glucose transport. It decreases the effectiveness of insulin. And if you decrease the fat to less than 15%, then you will have increased, I'm stuttering over that one. Your insulin resistance improves when the fat content of the diet gets down to 15% or greater. That's what I should have said. Okay, so on the cardiovascular system, consuming oils, according to Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, who practiced for many years at the Cleveland Clinic, he says that consuming oils makes the lining of the arteries like Velcro. And they will reach out and they will get a hold of cholesterol. And they will form cholesterol deposits in the arteries, in the walls of the arteries. But he says when you eat greens multiple times a day, the greens will slick up the inside of the arteries and they'll make them a lot like Teflon. And the reason why that happens is greens happen to be one of the most nutrient-dense foods, and it's very anti-inflammatory. And so it will heal the inside of the arteries, and the blood will flow much freer through those type of arteries. You go with a high-fat diet, and you can cause the blood cells actually to start clumping together, and then they become real sluggish, moving through capillary beds and things of that nature. So, we want to go with the higher fat, the lower fat diet. Now, I went backwards. Okay, here we go. No, I went backwards again. Let's talk about what I call a fats continuum. The most of the fats that we want to eat would be at the top of an inverted pyramid, and those would be whole food fats. So whole foods would be, let's see, whole food fats. Help me out. What do you think? Nuts, very good. Avocados, yes. What? Almonds? Olives, yes, olives, yes, walnuts. There are a variety of foods, there are a variety of foods that fall into the whole food fat category, and those are very healthful to eat. So those are at the very top. That's what we want to eat the most of. But then as we move down, we get our cold-pressed fats. Now, the cold-pressed fats, the advantage of them, things like olive oil, when you have a cold-pressed olive oil or extra virgin olive oil, it's been cold-pressed, and it has not gone through that refining process with the hexane and with the heating the oils up. So those oils tend to be much less inflammatory than those that have been industrially prepared. And then going down beyond that, even when you move into the industrially prepared oils now, we have things like monounsaturated fats, olive oil, flaxseed oil, some safflower oil, some peanut oil. Some of these are mixed fats that you get into as well. But it's important to remember that even if you're talking about healthier oils, you're still talking about a refined food product. You're messing with the balance of nature here. And it requires that you have extra nutrients that are not in the food itself now in order to be able to metabolize that, just like what happens when you eat a refined sugar. You have to get the nutrients somewhere to metabolize that, and when you don't have it in the food that you're eating, your body usually takes it from other tissues. So our foods, our fats, are best if they're eaten in the natural state. Now moving on down, we have polyunsaturated fats. Those have lots of double bonds in them. They tend to be liquid. Those would be things like, for instance, soy oil, corn oil, sunflower oil, cottonseed oil. A lot of the vegetable oils would be in this category. These are better oils if you must fry. But you don't want to fry with a monounsaturated fat because it will denature the fat, and that it's not stable at the higher temperatures. So these fats, as you move on down, they contain omega-6, omega-3 fatty acids. If you're already eating a low-fat diet, whether you're having omega-3s or not becomes a much less important consideration. So remember again, whatever we do, you're dealing here with processed fats. Now moving on down that list a little further, we have saturated fats, and at the very bottom of the list are trans fats. Well, the saturated fats we now know all cause inflammation. They worsen cardiovascular disease. It increases insulin resistance. It has been found in animal products, and multiple studies have indicated that a high intake of high levels of saturated fats is what actually causes beta cell death in the pancreas. So tell me, what do you think some food sources of saturated fats would be? Coconut oil, that's one of the few. Coconut oil and palm oil, some of the palm oil, is about that's a vegetable source of saturated fat. Chicken fat, beef fat, what was that? Yes, your animal fats would be the other source of the saturated fats. If it's solid at room temperature, this is a saturated fat. So then at the very bottom of the list, of course, are the trans fats, and these are the partially hydrogenated vegetable shortenings, and they cause inflammation. They raise the bad cholesterol. They lower the good cholesterol. They increase your risk of heart disease and stroke, and they increase insulin resistance. So the saturated fats, those fats that are solid at room temperature, and the trans fats, also solid at room temperature. Those are the fats that are going to make diabetes worse, especially. But as you move up, the very best fats, you need fats. There's nothing wrong with eating a good fat. You know, it helps you absorb certain vitamins and minerals and things like that. But let's get them from a good source. And the good source, in my opinion, are all the whole food fats. So let's compare a standard American diet and a whole food plant-based diet, because I talk about that a lot. And we've discovered too that it's one of the best ways to reverse type 2 diabetes. So when the standard American diet is about 35% fat, and it's high in red and processed meats. You have a lot of prepackaged foods, and they add extra fat in that to increase the shelf life. I used to work in a food manufacturing company, and I worked out of the quality department because of my background in chemistry. And one of the things that we would do, if something did not last on the shelf, if it started to go stale toward the end of the shelf life, we would go back to the food chemistry lab, and we would have them to redevelop that recipe so that it would last longer on the shelf. And what did they do? They had added fat. You add fat or you add sugar. And so those things will help prolong your shelf life. Anyway, so it's a lot of that is about making money. Butter, candy and sweets are also in this diet. Fried foods, conventionally raised animals, high-fat dairy, eggs, refined grains, potatoes, and corn are also in the standard American diet. Now contrast that with the whole food plant-based diet. You know, if you don't add any additional fat when you're cooking and you're using whole food plant-based fats, it usually ranges still in the vicinity of 10 to 15%. Just doing plants. It's full of lots of green leafy vegetables. This kind of diet will have lots of fruits in it, and colorful vegetables and beans and legumes, your starchy vegetables, and nuts and seeds. But when you eat that way and you're eating low fat, your carbohydrate tolerance goes way up. So if you would like to eat more carbohydrates, what do? Decrease the fat in the diet, especially the saturated fats and the industrially prepared oils. So, how do you prepare foods without fat?
Saute them.
Yes, you can saute them. That's a good way. And you know you can even water saute. You know, when you're doing like an onion, you know, you're caramelizing an onion. You don't have to put the fat in the skillet. I mean, we didn't know that you could do that. Just add a little bit of water, and just right at the end, you let the water cook out, and let it'll brown the onions really nicely. Air fryers, that's a great way to cook without oil. And roasted okra. At our house, we learned about roasted okra a few years ago, and we'd have the grandkids over. And grandkids, you know, growing kids are just very hungry, and they'll eat just about anything.
But they would come to the table sometimes and they would look at it and go, I don't like that. And they would pass it, not put it on their plate. We said, oh no, you're at Grandma and Grandpa's. You've got to have 2 bites. And so we would pass the food around and they would take their 2 little bites. Well, they discovered they really liked a lot of things. And so I'm thinking of some in particular. But anyway, one time we had the roasted okra, and what I would do is I pick it when it's about this big in the garden, and I bring it in and rinse it off. I don't even cut the stem, the little cap. I leave a little of that on. And I put it out on a baking sheet, sprinkle a little salt on it, a little veggie salt or a little seasoned salt, and put it in a very hot oven, 450 degrees. 5 minutes, open it, shake the tray. 5 more minutes, shake the tray. 5 more minutes, take it out. And I better have the rest of the meal on the table, or it will never make it from that baking sheet to the table because it'll get eaten in the kitchen. But when I was thinking about this just a moment ago, I have to laugh because we had roasted okra today from the freezer. I got frozen okra out. He did. And we put it in the oven and we baked it, and not quite so high because it takes a little longer when it's frozen, and served it. Well, now I'm one of these little grandkids that loved it so much back then. Today he looked at the okra and he passed it. Well, you know, he's 19 now, and so we allowed him to pass it. No, he went back and he took his 2 bites. And so in a few minutes, we have a rescue dog, and he came over to where I was, and I said, dude, did you get some okra? And Seth's saying, okra? No, I'm not done eating. I haven't given him anything. Well, in a few minutes, Steve went and gave him some. Well, you know what? He acted just like Seth. The okra came right back out. So not everybody likes okra, not even our dude. So, but anyway, we love it when it's fresh and it's good. But back when they were little, one of the grandsons asked me, they had their servings, and he really liked the roasted okra, and so he asked for some more, and we passed it to him, and he's putting it out on his plate, and I said, called him by name, and I said, leave some for other people. Okay, Grandma. Well, in a minute I looked, there was one little okra pod left in the bottom of the bowl. Roasted okra is good stuff, but there's a lot of things you can do. Baked apples, we like to cook with a minimum amount of water, and when I can, when we heat something up, open it in the winter, I cook it, I boil it until the juice has gone back into the vegetable, especially with green beans. That works so well because you get the flavor back in. But I also season a lot with herbs. Rosemary goes really well with cabbage. Dill, a little bit of dill will give things a buttery flavor. So if you want to roast some potatoes, add a little dill to it, and you get the buttery flavor without the butter. So other substitutions that you can do when baking. In this, do we have the cup of oil in this? I don't think we do.
No, it's not in here.
Okay.
It's down at the very bottom, consider this.
Oh, and it tells you. Okay. So a tablespoon, how many tablespoons are in a cup? 16, and there's 120 calories in 1 tablespoon of oil. No matter what kind of oil, it's 120. So I guess it says there in the book, 1 cup has 16 tablespoons, 1,920 calories in a cup of oil. So if you're frying okra and you use a half a cup, right there's 960 calories just to fry your okra. So it's a whole lot better to roast it. What about when you're making muffins? Applesauce works very well as a substitution for oil. You can still put just a little bit. We're going to do a salad in a week or two. I don't remember which night. But it has a teaspoon of oil. It's just enough to help get the flavoring of some of the herbs into your salad greens and such. You don't have to use as much. We were recently at a meeting and we did a presentation and they had a lot of food samples and we were so excited because they were beautiful and some of them were so tasty. Everything I tried was really tasty. And then I saw the recipes. One of the recipes, they had marinated their vegetables in a cup of oil. It's like, okay, well, they poured a lot of it off before they served it. But we need to look for ways. So using the applesauce, the prune puree, if you're making something dark like brownies, white bean puree, if you're making something light colored like a hummus, you can use the white beans instead of the chickpeas and it makes it very creamy. Fruit spreads instead of margarine. Actually, that is the way I lost my first 10 pounds, is I stopped. I love toast. I love homemade bread with toast, made into toast and then slattered in margarine or butter. But I stopped and I started using fruit spread, and it really made a difference for me. And then the other thing is we like to use hummus for mayonnaise in our sandwiches instead of the mayonnaise because the hummus is a bean base, and so you're getting a little fiber that way. That's my tips.
Thank you, Karen. And the China study came out a number of years ago and had this graph in it. Dr. Campbell gave me permission to use it because I think it is so profound. This was back in 1925. They did a study comparing the different diets of various countries. And so you'll notice that the light gray indicates the amount of fat in the diet. And the little diamonds up there indicate the rate of diabetes. So you'll notice as the fat content of the diet decreased, what happened to the rate of diabetes? Yeah, it significantly went down. Let's read it backwards. As the fat in the diet increases, what happens to the rate of diabetes? So we should have learned from way back then that there was a strong correlation between the amount of fat that a person eats and the rate of diabetes. On the flip side, the dark gray indicates the percent of carbohydrates in the diet. So they're comparing diets by nations. And you'll notice that in the US of A, we had the lowest amount of carbohydrate in our diet, whereas in Japan, they had the highest amount of carbohydrate in the diet. If diabetes is a carbohydrate problem, a problem of too much carbohydrate, would you not expect to see just the opposite? But as the carbohydrate goes up, what happens to the rate of diabetes? It goes down. Right. Took us many years to understand why this is true. But now they've sorted out why. We'll probably talk about that a little more in another lecture. So the conclusion of all this is we need to eat whole food fats and avoid added fats as much as possible. So eat nuts and seeds in moderation. Search for new whole food recipes, and Google is just wonderful to help you with this because you can literally sit down to your computer and you just type in whole food plant-based entrees, for instance, and you'll have 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, I don't know how many, hundreds of recipes with full color pictures and already been evaluated whether they were good or whether they were not good by somebody else, So it gives you a great idea of places to go and search for these. And so you need to use oils and fats sparingly. Karen buys usually a small little bottle of olive oil, and we keep that in our kitchen for like salad dressings or things like that. But she just doesn't use much of it. And it will literally, one little bottle like that will last her months. Yes, ma'am.
The mist sprayer is a really good way to keep the fat down. So you can spray your vegetables lightly.
Yes.
Popcorn, and you're not getting anything.
Excellent observation. Yes, absolutely right. Okay, she says the mist sprayer is a very good way to spray onto your vegetables or popcorn or things like that and keep the amount of fat way down in the recipe. So use your oils sparingly and avoid high-fat foods such as fried foods, processed foods, condiments. Take for instance a jar of mayonnaise. You don't think of mayonnaise, a lot of people, as being fat, but by calories, a jar of mayonnaise is 98% fat. By calories, 98% fat. So we got to watch what we eat. So now next week we're going to be talking about proteins that heal. There are proteins that heal. So just one last verse to leave you with, to ponder and think about. Ask and it shall be given you, seek and ye shall find. So if you need to have some recipes that are lower in fat, seek, you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Google it and you can get it. Okay, well, that's not quite what the verse says. But it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth. He that seeketh findeth. To him that knocketh it shall be opened. And I think the principle actually does hold true for us with our diabetes reversal. Now, since I ended up actually with a broken shoulder, I have asked Mike if he would lead out in our session. And somebody told us, when I first mentioned that, they said, uh-oh. Uh-oh. So work them hard, Mike.